Hello, hello.
Hey, Dustin.
Hey,
Thanks for
Felix, I
having
want
me.
to welcome you, and I want to welcome everybody to Signal's Continuous Identity Sessions, where we connect the brightest minds in identity with strategies and real-world approaches to make IAM work better. I'm still your host in week 2, and generally curious in technology and security and identity, Dustin Avol. In each session, we're going to sit down with people building and managing identity at enterprise scale. People who have figured out how to eliminate bottlenecks, reduce manual work, and implement automation that actually improves security without slowing down business. And these people we think are doing really cool in industry and interesting stuff in the industry. And today we're focusing on a topic about how to better manage non-human identities. If anybody out there has ever worked with machine access or service accounts, you know the sheer magnitude, among other things, that creates daily challenges. We're lucky to be joined today by Felix Gaehtgens, an identity strategist whose history as an entrepreneur, practitioner, industry analyst qualifies him well for this topic. So Felix, let me give a little background to everybody about who you are and what you've done, at least a little taste. Like I mentioned, Felix is a former analyst at Gartner, where he covered identity markets, including privileged access management. He's been a technology advisor to large corporations and public institutions. He's been a co-founder, a CEO, a product manager, an architect in various industries across automotive, telecom, et cetera, and worked with many technologies in these positions, from technical to management roles. His career spans a full cycle from developing device drivers for Unix systems that we might want to hear a little bit about, through building IS ground up. Ultimately, Felix led IAM teams and managed many IAM initiatives. And I want to remind the audience that's joining us live, please hit that Q&A panel and we'll try to tackle as many questions as we can throughout the show. And of course, we'll follow up with those that we don't have time for today. Felix, thank you for joining us.
Sure thing. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. What have you been up to lately?
Well, I've been scuba diving today. And but apart from that, I've been writing quite extensively on the art of machine IAM and trying to convince people to get rid of NHIs because they are just the asbestos of cybersecurity.
Yeah. I saw that post, I think it was on LinkedIn where I saw it, about us comparing them to asbestos, and I love the idea. Maybe you can just tease our audience about the asbestos of NHI for now.
Yeah, for sure. So that asbestos piece has definitely sparked some conversations. I like to use that analogy because things like static API keys and service accounts are really just technical debt. We call them non-human identities, but they're legacy artifacts we're drowning in. And the industry is focused on managing this debt better, but my focus is on how we stop creating it all together, because that's the real path forward. Otherwise, we're just doing asbestos management rather than choosing safe building materials to use as the foundational pieces of our architecture.
Really cool, and interesting to associate it with the building materials and the foundation of maybe some of our security practices. But let's not get too deep too quickly. So let's before we dive in too far, as a little scuba reference for you there, maybe you can help the audience better understand a little bit of a rundown what you were doing in the analyst role, the kind of enterprises that you've helped to navigate different challenges around, and maybe advice that you've really given in the past in terms of just some ideological framing.
Yeah, absolutely. Recently, I spent 12 years at Gartner covering IAM markets and writing Magic Quadrants for things like privileged access management. In that role, you see a lot of patterns across hundreds of organizations globally. You see kind of what works at enterprise scale, what fails, and more importantly, you see this growing gap between how we secure humans and then at the same time the explosion of machine identities that are often left behind. And the common thread that everyone was struggling with was just the sheer scale of machine access. They were trying to apply human-centric security models to a problem that was really growing exponentially faster and behaving in completely different ways.
I've seen a number or ratio in the past. I think I saw it in your blog as well, a 45-to-1 number. I don't know how accurate that is, or maybe different folks have different metrics, but Was recognizing that sheer magnitude, the 45 to 1, or at least that type of scale, really the pivotal moment that tipped you off to say, we're seeing something that's a major shift here?
Well, I think yeah, the scale obviously is staggering, and this is where most organizations are really blind. And in the past, I think I used that average ratio of 45 machine identities to every human employee, but in modern cloud native organizations, it could be much more. It could be thousands to one. Just think about it this way, right? Your company has way more API keys, which really is a piece of asbestos, each one of them, than employees, right? And I think Microsoft research show that only about 2% of all machine identity permissions are actually ever used, right? So it's really this massive unmanaged attack surface.
Yeah. We'll get into some of the current threat landscape and the attack surface, but I know before you were writing and blogging a lot about that, we interacted a bunch about your coverage and your emphasis on a more architectural approach to IAM and identity fabric. Maybe we can talk a little bit about transitioning from a tool-centric approach to an identity fabric and how you might advise CISOs or identity organizations to start thinking about this as a real actionable step that folks can start off going towards an identity fabric.
Okay, so an identity fabric really is an architecture layer that connects your disparate security and identity tools, right? And if you want to talk about modern machine identity, that's kind of a critical service that plugs into this fabric. You could think of an identity fabric as, I mentioned, an architectural approach, and kind of like a central nervous system for your security architecture. So if you add continuous identity to that, then the machine IAM will provide like a set of, say, eyes or touch, and send critical signals about what the machines are doing through that nervous system. And the fabric ensures that those signals are understood by the brain, which would be your policy engine, which can then coordinate a response across the entire body, like revoking access. And so the fabric provides this connectivity and translation layer. But at the end of the day, as I already said, the biggest misconception I think that most organizations have is that building an identity fabric isn't about buying a new monolithic tool that calls itself Fabric, because as you might imagine, that's what a lot of vendors will just use and jump on now our Fabric. It's not it, right? Identity Fabric is really an approach, not a type of product. It's about changing how you think about identity, kind of moving from static provisioning to dynamic contextual evaluation. And the best part is you can actually start building an identity fabric with technologies that you already own by making them communicate using open standards. And so my advice really would be to start there. Don't look for a fabric vendor, because they don't really exist, but rather look for technologies that support the open standards like OAuth and authorization framework, and CABE and SSF to it whenever you can, in small doses at first, and expand later on. And then you'll need orchestration capabilities. You'll need to stitch together your fabric of tools using APIs, orchestration, and automation. And that really is the foundation of a modern composable architecture. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, I think it does, and I appreciate your references there. It sounds like some of the approaches to continuous identity is layered in as you build this, as you just said, composable architecture, and generating integration from signals or information that's shared between the services can help you to be more real time in your approach. And that, am I right in sort of the assumption then that machine and non-human identities become another layer in that composable approach?
Yep, exactly. So you mentioned the whole thing about continuous identity, which is what this whole series is about. So why don't we just dive right into this, right? So if we think about the identity fabric being what really makes continuous identity practical at scale, then the identity fabric connects your systems, and standards like CABE are kind of the one of the shared languages that they use to speak with each other. For example, that could allow your endpoint security tool to talk to your IDP, which Ian mentioned about in the last episode, which I listened to yesterday. And that may talk to your cloud access controls, and all kind of using the same event format. So that's kind of the network effect that makes Zero Trust truly achievable, because we're kind of closing the last mile on this, right? And I think that the best way to start would really kind of be to focus on a bridge strategy, right? You don't need to replace everything. You begin with new deployments to stop creating more legacy debt. What I mean with that is, as you deploy anything new, right, stop creating more technology debt, more tech legacy. For example, don't use NHI, but use modern, dynamic, ephemeral credential constructs that you probably already have. You just need to start using them, right? Provide that guidance for your teams to do so. And then pick, after you pick high value case. For example, you might take the device compromise signal from your existing XDR or EDR tool and translate that into a KDB, and that will then let you prove the value of near real-time response without massive ripping and replacing of things.
I appreciate you plugging our first episode, and want to remind everybody listening and on demand that you can go back and watch some of those. Episode 1, we talked to Ian Glazer about what is continuous identity. It was a good kicking off point. I also saw you actually speaking of some of these on we'll give a plug for Identity at the Center of the other podcast, talking a lot about this topic as well. And so you're out there talking about it. So let's maybe start with or go back to some definitions, I guess. How do you think about machine identity versus non-human identity? Is there a real easy way to distinguish?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So non-human identity has become a kind of sloppy and imprecise buzzword that usually refers to legacy artifacts that every company is drowning in, right? API keys, service accounts, static passwords. And I like to call it what it is. It's technical debt, right? Whereas machine IAM, or machine identity and access management, is really a practice with the goal of securing machine-to-machine interactions using dynamic, ephemeral patterns, right? The goal isn't just to manage NHIs or credential debt. It's actually about not needing to store credentials at all, right? And this distinction is really critical, because NHI management is like having proper asbestos handling protocols. It reduces risks, but you're still living with dangerous material that really requires this constant vigilance. A modern machine IAM program uses, as I mentioned, safe modern building materials from the start. So I think our goal as an industry shouldn't be to get better at handling asbestos. It should be to stop creating these toxic assets altogether. And yet, of course, there are going to be these NHIs that you're never going to be able to get rid of, right? Because maybe your provider is really ancient in their security thinking, and the only way they'll allow you to interact with their API is by handing out a static API key. I get it, right? There are these cases where you still have asbestos somewhere and you need to manage it, right? But the goal is, like, for everything new that you create, you shouldn't be using this anymore, right? You should do it properly and move to these dynamic ephemeral patterns rather than using NHIs.
I know firsthand from working with you as an analyst that you were tracking a lot of different enterprises globally, large organizations that you were working with. And I can only imagine those ratios we were talking about with regards to the scale of machine identities. How big is that problem really? Like how much were you seeing it across these large enterprises? Was it rampant? Is it kind of here and there? What's the scope of this?
Well, I mean, we kind of didn't talk about it. It's hard to put a number on it. You see so many different numbers from all kinds of vendors, especially those vendors that try to sell you tools to handle asbestos more safely, right? The thing is this, like, if you assume a baseline of 1 to 45 for most organizations, I think that's probably a good baseline. The real question is, like, well, how many of them are you actually aware of, right? Like, how many of them do you actually know that you have? And then the next thing is like, why are you even still using static service account and static credentials? Like, you're maybe trying to make it a little bit safer by putting them in a vault, right? But they're still static, right? If your application ceases to exist, there's still this thing out there that needs to be managed. And then you have to think about, is this identity lifecycle is directly borrowed from the way that we manage humans. If I start working for an organization, you should probably assume that I'm going to work for more than just a few minutes. Right? You're not going to kick me out like in my first minute of my working day, or I'm not going to walk away after a minute. But for machines, that's absolutely normal. You have a process that starts. It might work for a few minutes. It might have, might work a little bit longer. It might provide a service, but they get instantiated, they get issued continuously, and sometimes they even get load balanced. Like you're starting 50 of these things. They all kind of do the same thing. So why would you be slinging a static pattern for these very dynamic workloads? It really makes absolutely no sense. It's totally backward to think about it that way. But of course, this is what we're all used to, how we handle human identities, and we kind of take the same pattern and say, well, non-human is just another type of person, and that's like totally the wrong approach here.
I think we see a lot of similarities here in organizations that are still managing that machine access with a similar approach. And you've mentioned some of the static service accounts, long-lived credentials, maybe even some secrets rotation. But why is it? Why do you think that teams are just defaulting to treating those machines the same way they treat humans?
Well, look, first of all, because they probably don't know any better. And second of all, because we kind of sort of could afford to be sloppy until perhaps recently ago. Now with the advent of AI agents, that's not holding. We do not have that luxury of being sloppy anymore. When everything was on-prem, hey, we're all sinners, including myself. When I was really on the keyboard, I also wrote some scripts that noodled something in the database every night, and of course I put the username and password in the script. It was the easiest way to do it. Actually, I did. I had a config file. I put the username and password for the database into that config file. Like, I could slap myself. But hey, 20 years ago or 25 years ago, when I was still young and handsome, hey, that's the way we kind of did it, right? And then came the whole wave of cloud and automation and hyperscalers and all of these kinds of things. And it really started to creep, but still some people kind of held onto it. And then there was this thing called secrets managers where you could just stash your stuff in and then you could retrieve. You kind of protected it a little bit. But then the question, of course, is like, how does your workload authenticate to that secrets manager, right? With another secret? Well, where do you store that secret, right? Oh, you can encrypt it. Okay, well, where do you store the encryption key? So it's kind of like this vicious cycle that way. And I'll tell you something. I mean, I was really exasperated to see, like, what are you guys doing? It was like, this is, you're pushing the problem from one side of the table to the other side of the problem.
Yeah, where does it end?
You've not solved this bootstrap problem of how do you give some kind of workload or some kind of machine its first credential without actually having to store any credential. That's a really important thing. You cannot really do this with these classical machines. You always have these vulnerabilities, and if they're static, then they exist until you remove them, and you can't remove them unless you have some kind of identity life cycles, which are borrowed from you. So it's a train wreck waiting to have, like a slow-moving train wreck. It's a complete impedance mismatch. Sorry for getting me riled up about this, but it's crazy.
It's great. No, I appreciate your take, and I appreciate you going on and getting into the weeds and talking to folks about where their challenges might lead. Because at times I think we address what's right in front of us without really understanding the repercussions that are possible. And it could go deeper and deeper.
And especially because we actually have the tools to do it properly, right? And I always like to talk about this Swiss Army knife that you need for your machine IAM, right? We do have those tools available as of today, right? If you're running in the cloud, you already have some sort of managed service accounts, which is something. It could either be an AWS, it's like an IAM role that you attach to a workload, and that workload then acts under a dynamic credential, really just for this particular workload, based on the identity metadata of that particular workload. Or in Azure, you have the same thing. On Google, you have the same thing. In Kubernetes, you have, for example, Kubernetes service accounts that have all these dynamic credentials. So the whole idea is workload starts, bang, gets a dynamic credential. As it starts, workload terminates, poof, identity's gone. Clean, secure. We have all of this, right? But why are some people still sticking API keys into a secrets vault if they don't have to? And I think that the real problem is lack of guidance and lack of awareness. Because if you're a software developer, you're not going to get any guidance from the organization. You call up the IAM team and say, you know what, I've got this thing and I've got this piece of code that I wrote, and I got to talk to a database. I got to call this API. Like, how do I do this securely? How do I get my credentials? What do you get from this? Crickets. Like, they're like, oh, we're business oriented. We don't go into the weeds like this. But machine to machine interactions, they power probably about 100% of your business processes. So if that's not a business problem, then what is? So we do have these things. We need the guidance for people to tell them how to do that. Because good developers are lazy developers. They'll take whatever guidance you give them, they'll take whatever example code they have, and then they'll put that into practice.
Well, one of the things we like to direct back to on these continuous identity sessions, and we're deep into the series now. We're on, as we said, episode 2. So very,
deep.
very, 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 very deep. But we like to pull it back to say, how do folks get started? It sounds like one of the ways you're recommending is use the tools that you might already have.
Exactly. And it kind of depends whether we're talking about the fabric or whether we're talking about machine IAM. Which one would you like me to talk about?
Well, I mean, we're talking about machines, but I guess I'd even like to talk more specifically, and you started to mention about machine-to-machine interactions, and it makes me think about MCP servers and securing AI agents and the like. And
okay.
I'm curious about that specifically, but also about the identity team's role in that interaction as opposed to the business or security, and what you're seeing and what you think maybe it should be. How should that be approached?
All right, let me try one angle, okay? And then if that's not what you want to know, then okay. So let me talk about machine IAM in particular, right? So this is how you would start. The first thing that you have to do really is to form a machine IAM working group with all the executive sponsorship, cross-functional stakeholders, and a clear charter. Why? Because everyone is creating and using these machine identities, right? But there are probably only a few folks that are tasked to clean up this mess. And effectively, if you approach it in that classical way, then you have somebody that's cleaning up after the kids, right? This is not going to scale. It's not going to work. The only way it's going to work is if you actually teach your kids to be more tidy. And what that IAM working group does is, first of all, you bring in all the stakeholders. So you have security, of course, but you also have development. You have the DevOps engineers. You have infrastructure folks. You have operations folks. All of these folks that somehow use machine-to-machine interactions or enable machine-to-machine interactions. You also have the IAM team in there, by the way. But this thing might not even be driven by IAM. Right? IAM could be more of a consulted partner, or it could be an informed partner, right? IAM could, of course, also take some kind of lead on this, but they would have to get much more familiar of how machine IAM is actually being used throughout the organization. Then you need to understand what teams are building and map existing capabilities, such as how your IDPs use OAuth, what kind of API gateways you have, what kind of PKI capabilities you have, all that. And you also have to build an inventory of all the static crap that you already have, of all of your asbestos, because that's what you'll likely have quite a bit today. And then next thing is you have to work on standards and guidance. And that really means that you have to create reference architectures, decision trees, and make modern patterns the easy path so that a developer that needs to call an API knows exactly how it can get its dynamic credential on the fly, how it can use that, and not default to legacy technology debt. And then with the technical implementation, you have to build out your Swiss Army knife. A lot of the stuff you already have. I talked about API gateways, PKI, all of these kinds of things. You might want to use some additional things, or you might want to use them even though you have them already. You might want to take a closer look at things such as managed service accounts, or things such as SPIFFE, SPIFFE, which is the secure production identity framework for everyone. You might want to look at workload identity federation, which allows you to federate dynamic identity patterns from the cloud provider with each other, or even with your on-prem. You might take a look at some of the newer OAuth flows, such as token exchange, pretty important that, and claims transformation, all of these things. And then you can really focus on these standards-ready platforms and prioritize the high-value systems that you have, with the goal to actually stop creating new static credentials, address some of the legacy debt through migration, and establish this continuous improvement. And now I got to ask you, was that actually what you were asking me, or did I totally go off on another?
No, definitely. And I loved the touch on open standards and the interoperability that promotes, along with Auth-Gen as another standard development and working group to add into there. And because especially when we're talking about machines, working with machines, as you've touched on throughout, this is a cloud native approach oftentimes that may be different from traditional IAM approaches, where you might be able to provision access in advance and then it stays pretty static, but these machines are kind of spinning up and down consistently, constantly. And I'm curious how to approach the access decisions at that speed. Is standards a way to approach that? When we're talking about the speed and we talked about scope, but like really the speed as well.
Right. Well, scope, speed. There are a few other things in the mix, because this is actually a great question. Look, we have a lot of technology that's very mature, right? And that technology propagates information and context for making access decisions. I mean, you know this because you're Signal, right? Your technology is based on that as well. However, the actual access control often happens at control points, such as API gateways or within microservices, as part of the application, or even within databases. And that's really a key point here, and also kind of like a tenet of an identity fabric is to provide a general authorization infrastructure that uses a common policy format and framework for doing authorization decisions really consistently. And this is a technology that's not really new, although the industry kind of dabbled along at glacier speed over the last 1.5 or maybe even 2 decades. And now suddenly there's this great push forward with new standards, specs, and framework. And we've got Open Policy Agent, Auth-Gen, CEDAR, this thing that just escapes me. What was the thing that Google built?
Zanzibar?
Yes, exactly. Thank you. And a few others there as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, it also, you mentioned one of our magic words around context too. And I remember some of the research that you did around identity first security and the 3 C's, that when we talk about continuous identity, one of the C's right there in continuous and the context, and then making it really consistent. And I'm curious if you see any difference in the approach of those 3 C's from humans to machines, or if a practical example like a CI/CD pipeline or a container deployment or dynamic machine identity might work differently than the human access evaluation, or would it? Is all that sort of just the same approach once again, and we're back to the composable architecture of an identity fabric?
Well, let's maybe break this down just for those that haven't seen episode 1 of what the 3 C's actually are.
And reminder to go back and watch it. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and I'll try to very, very quickly summarize that, right? So the 3 C's, consistent. That kind of means that access controls are implemented the same way, regardless of whether it's a human API or an AI agent. Contextual means that the decisions consider real-time factors like the security posture or the device compliance, not just the static role. And continuous means that these decisions are constantly reevaluated as that context changes. So you can't have one without the others. They all work together to create a truly adaptive security model. And I like to use the following analogy, because we all use that every day if we're driving. Like, think if you're driving somewhere, you're using a GPS, modern GPS, navigating with real-time traffic data. So consistent is the underlying logic that's used for each trip. And contextual is like the real-time data that you get. Accidents, traffic jams, road closures. Your GPS pulls that in from other systems on the internet, right? And that's actually what standards like SSF and CAPE enable. And then continuous is the act of constantly recalculating the route based on that new data. So that's kind of what CAPE events could trigger. This is kind of a system that adapts to reality in real time, right? And then you asked me about an example of a pipeline, for example, like how that could work in a CI/CD pipeline, how dynamic machine ID might work differently than what most teams do today. So today, unfortunately, a common approach is to create a service account, a static service account with broad permissions, kind of stash that in a secrets manager and hope for the best, right? A better way would be to do that in a dynamic way, which is like when your container spins up, it gets unique, short-lived identity, maybe an X509 certificate. And now here's the continuous part, right? If the security tool detects that the build environment becomes non-compliant, access can be instantly revoked mid-build. The build can then be trashed. And plus, we can enforce additional scanning to happen next time, since the build and its input may have been tainted. Ian used another example over there. He said, well, if you're not supposed to be working anymore, you shouldn't really touch the pipeline. And I would use that example because, we all have to, fight deadlines and kind of work late in the evening. So maybe that wasn't the most elegant example, but that could be one, of course, as well, right?
Sure. And, given the broad scope of the opportunities to work on these, to apply these new approaches, or more dynamic and continuous, if I could say, for the IAM leaders and the practitioners looking to address these challenges, how would you recommend they prioritize the machine identities or the use cases to tackle first? Because we've talked a little bit about real-time evaluation, things like CAPE and triggering based on shared signals, but not everything needs this real-time evaluation, right?
No, and well, when you're asking me about how should you prioritize, and I'm going to hijack that question a little bit and talk about the regular machine identity stuff first, right? So the strategy there really should be simple. Stop the bleeding first, right? Prioritize creating a secure, easy to use, paved path for all new applications and services using modern dynamic identity patterns for machines, right? And internally, if you're going to sell that, that sales pitch would be about risk reduction and developer velocity, right? Now, for executives, it would be about drastically reducing the attack surface. For developers, it's about giving them standard automated way to get access so they can ship faster. So it's a win for both security and the business. And don't try to boil the ocean, just stop creating new legacy debt, right? Don't lead with technology, but lead with business impact. Tell them that with standards like, if you bring CAPE in there, for example, you can cut breach containment from an average of 73 days, perhaps down to seconds or minutes, which has a massive impact. If the average $4.88 million is the cost of a breach these days, according to the latest studies from IAM.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love it. I mean, I think looking at this as a more foundational approach as opposed to layering more technology on top of it. And I hear you about adding more technical debt. One of the concerns that we hear is about the operational complexity that introducing new dynamic approaches might give. In other words, in a historical, more static, maybe role-based or just purely machine focused environments, when we're looking at these older school approaches, or legacy, I guess we'll say, tends to be easier to troubleshoot and audit what's going on because it's not constantly moving, right? Or maybe it's not. So I guess I would ask, how do you address it, or how am I misspeaking there?
Well, I beg to disagree, because I find it's actually quite the opposite, right? With a static, long-lived credential, when it's compromised, you have no idea who used it, when, or from where. Well, you might know when, obviously, but your audit trail is really a bit of a black hole. But then again, in a dynamic, event-driven world, every single access decision is logged with its full context: who, what, when, why, and exactly which security signal or cave events influence your decision. And so you have this rich observable trail that makes troubleshooting and auditing dramatically easier and not harder. And let me give you an example of where these dynamic approaches provide radical transparency, right? Because when access denied, you don't just see access denied. You see access denied because the Kate event was received from CrowdStrike at 10:05 a.m., indicating the device compliance posture changed. It moves troubleshooting from a forensic guessing game to more of a straightforward data-driven process. And I really think it's fundamentally easier to manage.
Yeah, I like the approach. I don't mind the contradiction to coming up with a different way to audit and manage, because we know that that's a concern as well, right? Not just making everything work in real time, but then how can I go back and audit and review what had happened? So I think it's an important step, especially with machines as well. I want to thank you for your time today. As we start to wrap up here, I wonder, Felix, if you could tell folks one thing that they should know about machine identities, or about the new approach, the new, more dynamic approach, I think I know around what you might recommend, but what might that be?
I think the fundamental thing is you're all in this together. You can't just fix some things that other people are causing. You have to give people the right patterns for this. Just put yourself in the shoes of the developer. You need to understand how to use these dynamic identity patterns. And they're actually fairly simple to use. It's actually really much simpler for you, because all you do is you make this call, you get your identity, use that identity to do whatever you need to do, right? You don't need to sling credentials around, you need to interface with secrets managers. You may still have to do a little bit of this for the legacy patterns. You really have some legacy stuff, but that really should be the easy path forward. And that's what you need to get your organization to, because you already have most of these things. If you're using any of the clouds, you already have many of these dynamic constructs. If you have Kubernetes, you have Kubernetes service accounts, although you probably might want to look at Spiffy as well. You can use workload identity federation, which really is just OAuth flows, OIDC flows to actually make them work with each other. So a lot of the stuff you already have. Now, where there's a bit of a catching up to do is in authorization frameworks, because identifying things is one part of the game, then figuring out what they need to do next and finding a common policy model for that, that's going to be the next thing in this. But really help your organization get better at this. And I like Ian's analogy of I'm a piano player myself. I use more than 4 or 5 keys, right? So you really need to have these additional keys on there, right? And I think dynamic machine identity patterns are probably another octave of keys that most of you probably have. You just haven't really started using them.
Yeah, I am not much of a piano player. I probably only use 4 or 5 keys or whatever amount are used to play.
The black keys, just the black ones.
Yeah, that's right. Taking that one step further, there's been a bunch of steps to mention of what some people who might listen to this session could implement. in their environment, or maybe not implement, right? I mean, you talked about standards, you talked about the asbestos approach, the technical debt. What would be one thing that you could tell them, if you could only implement one thing like next week, what would you advise that someone focuses on?
Well, you mean something completely new, because I think in most of the cases, you're probably already using bits and pieces of that. You just have to use it more pervasively, right? So if you really are still using API keys or static credentials for something, I would look at, either maybe a service mesh if you're using Kubernetes, right? Or if you're using the cloud, look at the dynamic workload patterns that they already have. Look at managed service accounts. If you're using Kubernetes, I already did mention, I did mention service meshes. You might take a look at Spiffy, right? Or Cert Manager, all of these things that you may already, I think it's not so much of a question like what new things could use. If there's like a real new thing, yeah, maybe service meshes or Spiffy. But it's more like the things that you already have. Try using them and expanding the scope. If you have an IDP, you're already using OIDC, most likely. Look at token exchange and how that can actually help you transform your input tokens into another token format to use within your microservice, because you can do much finer grained authorization with that. So it's really kind of just build on what you already have.
Yeah, I appreciate that actionable steps that folks can take and actually, work on building towards a better approach, as opposed to, just sort of theoretically understanding how we can just modernize things. So I think it's important.
Plus Cave. Plus Cape. Cave, of course. Look at Cave. Yes. Cape is the
I appreciate that.
I love Cave.
Felix, where can we follow you? Do you have any sort of speaking gigs that are lined up or events that you'll be at? Where can we stay up to speed with what you have going on and what's next?
Yeah, this is the last one I've done this week. I don't have anything yet. It'll probably, something's probably going to come up. Just follow me on LinkedIn. Connect to me. If you just have any questions, just ping me. I tend to be fairly responsive. I do most of my posting on LinkedIn. I got a few more articles that are about to publish pretty soon.
Yeah, can't wait. I'll make sure to follow up. And we like to end with a constant, consistent, I guess, using one of the 3 C's, question for folks on the show. What's something that you continuously do or try to improve on? Like for me, I can share that I'm a golfer, although I don't seem to be getting any better, even though I continuously attempt and try. Sometimes, in fact, it feels like it's going the opposite direction. Is there something that you can share that you approach continuously and are attempting to improve or enjoy, or anything of that sort?
Well, apart from scuba diving, which is a big passion of mine, I think I continuously try to challenge my own thinking, and I continuously try to talk to people that do challenge my thinking in many different ways. I learn with all of that. I really don't like it when, for example, I write something and I send it to you to read it. Yeah, great, wonderful, good job. It's like, no, like, what's wrong with this thing? Tell me, I'm going to get better at this. So challenge our own thinking, challenge our own understanding. And this is really the only way that we can get better at it. Because if we're not wrong, we will never evolve, right?
Yeah, great request for feedback, and follow Felix on LinkedIn. And I want to thank you again, Felix Gaehtgens, and thanks to everybody who joined us today live and on demand. We appreciate the comments and questions and the engagement. And a reminder, as we mentioned, these sessions are recorded and available at signal.ai and on our YouTube channel. You can subscribe at signal.ai and get details on all the upcoming episodes, as well as resources under the docs link on the right of the screen in the follow-up email. And the reminder that next time on Continuous Identity Sessions, we'll be talking with Darren Rolls, former CTO of SailPoint and current founder and CTO of Identity Innovation Labs, where we'll talk a little bit more about bringing your identity program and existing tooling up to real time without starting over. That episode will be live September 4th at 10 a.m. Pacific. You can watch it and all Signal Continuous Identity Sessions on demand. Felix, thank you once again. Really appreciate you joining and having you as a gift, as a guest. And
Thanks.
until next time, let's continuously work to keep making identity work better. I'm Dustin Avol. We'll see you next time on Signal's Continuous Identity Sessions.
Thanks for
Bye
having
now.
me.